Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, November 1st, 2025. Apologies for the late upload today. Today we are going to be talking about the state of Alaska and another poll out of the state, really shocking and being quite interesting to see new data out of the state showing Mary Peltola in a great position for the United States Senate elections in the 2026 midterms. The reason why this poll is shocking at baseline largely comes from the fact that this is a state that has overwhelmingly voted for the Republican Party as of late, and looking at the last presidential election, it is the Republicans who won this state by a margin of roughly 14 percentage points. And so 2 years later, to see that there is a Senate election up with an incumbent Republican who's been serving in office for quite some time, over a decade going into this election, to now see that Mary Peltola, as a Democrat in this race, stands to reason that she could win this election in a year's time, really does throw a bit of a wrench in the plans of the Republicans in the 2026 Senate races should Mary Peltola vie for the Senate election in about a year. Now, Mary Peltola has yet to actually comment on what exactly she wants to do. We knew that back in August, it was Chuck Schumer who met with her and tried to convince her that the best course of action for her was indeed to run for Senate. And I think it's because he saw her as a prime opportunity for Democrats in a midterm year where there were very limited opportunities at winning over voters when it came down to Senate elections. The target states that came into reach were Iowa, Ohio, Texas, all states where right now, in my prediction I made earlier today, in fact, all rank in as likely for the Republican Party. With Mary Peltola, Alaska immediately becomes a lean state at best for the Republicans. It becomes one that the Democratic Party could actually target and invest a lot of money in given her electoral performance just a year ago in the 2024 cycle. Now, I know I just spent a lot of time talking about the presidential cycle, telling you that Alaska is a red state, but why is Mary Peltola different? Well, she stands to be one of the most popular politicians when it comes down to net approval rating. When we actually take a look at the way that voters view all of these candidates across the state, Mary Peltola nets in at around +7 across the state. Nick Begich III, the incumbent U.S. rep, is at +2. Dan Sullivan, the Republican she'd be up against in a year's time, is down 1 point. Lisa Murkowski is down 23. Mike Dunleavy is down 13. J.D. Vance is down 3. Donald Trump is net even. The point is that Mary Peltola leads in the 2026 hypothetical matchup, even in an electorate that prefers Trump to Harris by 12 and is roughly an identical margin to that of what we saw in the House election in 2024. And that brings me to my point about why exactly, she's even in the running for this, why we see her as this, all competitive race here, who, when you see her House results compared to where Kamala Harris was on the presidential level, it really shows exactly why this is so exceptionally impressive. I mean, the margin of victory for Nick Begich was, no more than 2.5 points across the state. And to see that Harris lost the state by 14, it stands to reason in a better national environment, Mary Peltola probably would have won in the state of Alaska and been reelected to the United States House of Representatives. And so that really makes a difference, right? You're looking at it from a 12-point smaller margin on the House level, which means that in 2026, it's going to be a very similar race. Alaska only has 1 congressional district, so it's a statewide race no matter what she runs for. The poll says that she would do well in the Senate race. She would do well in the governor's race, exceptionally well in the governor's race. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But the point here and the main takeaway is that ultimately, Mary Peltola stands to be the one Democrat who could take this race from being likely for the GOP as it is right now. Some of the race ratings even consider it to be safe for the Republican Party. The moment she enters into this race, the ratings will change immediately. And that's because data points like these have become not consistent, but more common than not. In the first data we saw from Alaska Survey Research, which is the gold standard of polling data in the state of Alaska, they released numbers back in August showing Dan Sullivan up by about 5 points across the state. This was a time where Donald Trump's approval rating was not nearly as bad in the state. And overall, too, right, it was a time where Mary Peltola had not seemingly, at least, engaged with this idea that she would decide to run. And so looking at the data change between August and October, it's quite substantive, but to see it backed up again by another firm that did a poll back in July that is finding a very different result now, I think it stands to say that this shows improvement for Mary Peltola despite her not actually entering into the race. And I think we're seeing why, right? As J.D. Vance and Donald Trump don't rank in at popularity of +12 when they won the last cycle by +14, but this is a recalled vote of +12, it shows that there were a lot of voters out there and that there are a lot of voters in Alaska who voted for Trump in the last election, but simply do not approve of the job that he is doing as president of the United States. And looking at, there's a lot of supporters here too, many independents who, backed Mary Peltola, but Republicans just outnumber Democrats in this state. You will find that that is really where she does quite well in the Senate races. Now, what actually is the data saying? Where is she actually leading against Dan Sullivan in this race? I think that's a question everybody wants to know. Well, here's what we find. In a November 2026 general election matchup, Mary Peltola outpaces Dan Sullivan in the state by roughly a point. It's a pretty substantive amount, and considering that Kamala Harris lost the state by 14, and the fact that she's even leading, I think, is really significant in its own right. 10% of Republicans are willing to back her in the election, 56% of independents, and 93% of 93% of Democrats, are aligned with her, in contrast with just 83% for Dan Sullivan from the GOP in this hypothetical matchup. And I think it shows the strength of Mary Peltola, who has had to rely on Republican voters to win her elections in the special election in August of 2022, her re-election in 2022, even this past cycle when she lost the race to Nick Begich. It was a race decided ultimately by 2 points, and that shows that she has an authority over a lot of these Republican voters who were all in for Donald Trump, and thousands of them crossed over and said, I'm voting for Mary Peltola in this state. I mean, it really was just so fascinating to see how much crossover support that she has, and we're actually seeing it in full display. In a state where the recalled vote is Trump plus 12, Begich plus 2, that electorate is choosing Mary Peltola over Dan Sullivan. And although the stakes might be significantly higher, I think it really ties down to the fact that voters trust Peltola, not just on the Senate level, but when asked about a hypothetical governor's matchup, in the first round of voting, she gets 41% support with all these other Republicans, and hypothetically speaking, those who are undecided can still say, I don't have an answer here. That 16% of voters in the first round say, I'm undecided, but 41% already jump out and say, I want Mary Peltola. And as the race gets on and on, what you find seeing, it get closer and closer, as you eliminate those who say that they're not sure, her number goes up to 49%. And then as you eliminate the other Republicans down, her numbers all the way skyrocket to finishing out with a 32% advantage over the Republican hypothetical in this race. I mean, absolutely insane margins in a state that currently has a Republican governor. A big reason for this is that Mary Peltola is popular. Voters like her. Voters look at her and say, I want her, to be the next governor, senator, representative, because in 2024, sure, the answer might have been different, but it is an entirely different electorate, and even amongst the same people who might have voted for Trump and voted for Nick Begich over Mary Peltola, a lot of these voters have now decided to say, I would choose her for the U.S. Senate. And that probably has to do with the fact that voters don't love Donald Trump in the state. The performance of the president of the United States is not in a great position. That is really the bad place for the GOP. They're only +1 in a state that they won by 14 in the last election. And this is not the only survey saying it. You have the Gold Standard poll that released, data just 2 weeks ago. You have Data for Progress backing up the change and progression in support that she's seen, risen. Data for Progress did that poll in July, found her down by 1. Now they have her up by 1. Alaska Survey Research had her down by 5. Now they have her up by 2. The data has changed, probably because the nation has changed their view of the president of the United States in a not so positive way. And thinking about how this would really shake up the Senate races, at almost an immediate factor, Alaska would be regarded as more competitive than Texas, Iowa, Florida, and Nebraska. And some could even argue that Alaska could be closer than the state of Ohio in 2026. And so I think that's really where this is going to be a big rallying cry from Democrats to get Peltola in this race, because what it tells us is that she would have a surefire way of being elected governor. But there's no national impact to be had of being elected Alaska's governor. When it comes down to a Senate race, though, she could be set for a 6-year term, expand her popularity, luck out, and have a better midterm cycle, or have a better cycle that she could run in 2032, depending on how that presidential election goes, if she wins that election in 2026. And it could really give her the time to stay in Washington, D.C., and go back to Alaska and make a name for herself in a way. The governorship would probably be the end of it, right? If she was in that position, and let's say she's unpopular, she would probably not be able to be elevated back to a national level. Let's say she takes on some stances across the state that are not popular on the national level, and with national Republicans who might be fine with her as governor, she might get pigeonholed into those races. Plenty of times, governors have gone on to, after being popular in red states, gone on to run for Senate, run for House, and lose. Not because they are these lackluster candidates, by no means at all. In fact, many cases, they've outpaced their Democratic counterparts tremendously, or in some cases, Republican counterparts. But it doesn't always translate to a nationally strong performance in a nationalized race. And looking at Alaska, this seems to be the best moment for Mary Peltola to do it. Not in a presidential, not in 2032, not in 2030, not in any of these times, because Alaska right now, 2028 would be the next time if Lisa Murkowski decides to vacate her seat, but they have a great working relationship. No shot that Mary Peltola decides to run against her, and there's probably little chance that she vies for a re-election bid when you could easily go for something that voters seem to be open-minded about. And given that Nick Begich is leading in the polling in Alaska, it doesn't seem to tell us that Nick Begich is a name that is disregarded or is disliked, at least not to the degree that it's necessary for her to feel more comfortable about a House re-election bid. Because sure, she could do it, but the Senate race is far more stakes. It is one where it seems like there's a very viable opportunity, and it's a 6-year term instead of a 2-year term. She wouldn't have to worry about J.D. Vance winning Alaska in 2028. She wouldn't have to worry about winning re-election every 2 years. The House, in many ways, I think, was a stepping stone to show us an exceptionally strong candidate in the state of Alaska for the Democratic Party. And as much as I do think that Democrats would like this to play it safe and for it to feel like she has more agency over what she decides to do, I think that at the end of the day, the most practical political decision for highest impact, high reward, high risk even, is running for United States Senate. And as the data suggests that it certainly is possible, I think as been the case with what has been the main determining factor in getting in Sherrod Brown in Ohio, getting strong Democrats to run in Iowa, getting James Tallarico in Texas, getting Roy Cooper in North Carolina, getting John Ossoff to run for re-election, Chris Pappas in New Hampshire. The call to action is there because the stakes could not be higher for the Democratic Party. And the odds at which they win back Senate control have been very slim as of late. And it's only possible with the top tier candidates like Mary Peltola in the state of Alaska. And they could very well see it happen. And the odds that she wins, I think, are a lot more than what we thought 3 months ago when she first floated this idea. And I do think that the data is telling us something. It's not a done deal, and it would not be a guarantee in the way the governorship might. But I think the impact of it would be far more tremendous. It would force Republicans to compete in a state that they didn't even expect to see as a battleground in 2026. And Alaska, as a state that has elected Mary Peltola less than 3 years ago, could very well find itself doing it again in a more Democratic wave midterm that we've seen in the most Democratic year we've seen since 2018 and since her entrance into politics. And I think that would be indicative of a lot and really be telling that it's certainly more possible than many people give it credit for, and Mary Peltola could find herself as the next United States Senator from the state of Alaska. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.